Imagine this. You're watching the evening news, and a story flashes across the screen. A brutal murder, and the only eyewitnesses are children.
Oh, wow. That's,
It's heavy stuff, right?
yeah.
But then it hits a conviction, a life-altering decision like that, truly hinge on the testimony of young kids.
Yeah, I mean, their memories can be so fragile.
Exactly. And what happens if their accounts have, little inconsistencies here and there? Like, are those honest mistakes or signs of something more?
You're talking about, like, are they being coached, or is it just a kid trying to remember a really, really awful thing?
It's a question that goes straight to the heart of justice, right? How much weight should the courts, especially the highest court in the land, give to those words, especially when the stakes are so incredibly high?
It's a tough one, and it's exactly what we're tackling in this deep dive.
We are. We're going deep into a landmark decision from the Supreme Court of the Philippines. The case is called People of the Philippines versus Antonio Almosara.
Got it. People versus Almosara.
That's the one. It has the GR No 2123512, and it was decided on July 24th, 2019. And get this, it really wrestles with those very questions. Young witnesses, a brutal crime, and the search for justice.
Sure, we're going to break it all down.
Here we are. We'll walk through the facts of the case, how it played out in the lower courts, zero in on that big legal question that landed before the Supreme Court, and of course, unpack their final judgment.
All right, let's get into it then.
Okay, so picture this. December 6th, 2000, Antipolo City. It's a day that ends in tragedy for a man named Arnulfo Cabintoy. He's killed, and the finger in accusation is pointed at Antonio Almosara, along with his father and two other relatives.
The whole family involved.
That's what the prosecution alleged. They claimed it was a conspiracy to murder, that they used treachery, basically ganging up on Arnulfo, and that they used bladed weapons in the attack. Grim stuff.
Yeah, that paints a pretty awful picture.
It does. Now, the first stage of this little battle takes place in the regional trial court of Antipolo City. They hear all the evidence, all the arguments, and ultimately the trial court judge finds Antonio Almosara guilty of murder.
Wow.
Guilty. And the sentence, reclusion perpetua, which is basically a life sentence under Philippine law. On top of that, he's ordered to pay a whole bunch of financial damages to the victim's family, civil indemnity, moral damages, exemplary damages, you name it. They even made him cover the actual costs of the case.
So it's like a huge financial burden on top of the prison sentence.
Absolutely, but hold on, because the story doesn't end there. Almosara, he's not giving up. He decides to appeal the verdict, and his case goes up to the Court of Appeals.
Okay, so another layer to this.
Exactly. Now, the Court of Appeals, they go through everything again, and they come to an interesting conclusion. They agree with the guilty verdict, so that stands. But they do make some changes to the financial side of things. They add something called temperate damages, and they also factor in interest on the money he owes.
Interesting. So the core of the conviction remains, but the financial details are getting tweaked.
That's it, exactly. So now we climb to the top rung of the ladder, the Supreme Court of the Philippines. And here, the question they're grappling with is, did the Court of Appeals get it right? Was it correct to uphold Almosara's conviction for murder?
So they're basically re-examining all the evidence, all the decisions made in the courts below.
Precisely. They're taking that big picture look to ensure that justice is truly being served.
Makes sense. And so what did they decide? What's the Supreme Court's final word on this whole case?
The Supreme Court, in the end, sides with the lower courts. They deny Almosara's appeal, which means the Court of Appeals' decision stays put, but they do make a few more adjustments to the specific amounts he has to pay.
So the murder conviction, it's set in stone.
It is. But here's where things get really compelling. What was the evidence that led to this outcome? What convinced the courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court, that Almosara was guilty?
Right, because this is serious stuff.
It is, and at the heart of it all is the testimony of two very young witnesses, Gregorio and Marif Cabintoy.
Wait, those are the
The
like...
victim's children, they were there, and they saw the whole horrific thing unfold.
Oh, man, that's just awful.
It's heartbreaking. Their testimony is what really paints the picture of what happened that night. They described how Antonio Almosara, along with his father, Adolfo, and their relatives, Anthony and Ronnie, came back to their home. But they weren't empty-handed. They were carrying bolos.
Bolos, aren't those like those big knives?
They are. Big, single-edged knives, pretty common in the Philippines.
Yeah, okay, I know what you're talking about.
So they've got these bolos, and this is all happening after a drinking session where apparently Antonio and Arnulfo, the victim, got into a heated argument.
So tensions were high, things got out of hand.
That's right. And according to Gregorio and Marif, Antonio is the one who makes the first move. They say he pinned their father down and just started stabbing him over and over.
Oh, God.
And then, while their father is helpless, they say the other Almosaras join in the attack.
So it's like a coordinated assault.
That's how it was presented. Now, the prosecution, they also bring in another witness, a man named Wilfredo Almacen. He was a neighbor, and he was also the barangay chairman.
Okay, so like a local leader.
Exactly. And he testifies that he saw the Almosaras running away from the scene, covered in blood. He actually managed to catch Antonio shortly after.
So you've got eyewitness accounts putting them at the scene of the crime.
Right. And to really seal the deal, the prosecution presented the medico-legal report, which confirmed that Arnulfo died from multiple scab wounds. No question about it.
So the evidence against Almosara seems pretty strong at this point.
It does, but remember, there are always two sides to every story. So what was Almosara's defense? What was his version of that night?
Yeah. What did he say happened?
Well, he had a completely different take. He claimed that the big argument, the one that sparked everything, wasn't between him and Arnulfo, but actually between Arnulfo and Ronnie, one of the other relatives.
Okay, so shifting the blame a bit.
Right. He goes on to say that when he tried to intervene to break things up, Arnulfo actually attacked him.
So he's saying he was trying to be the peacemaker.
That's his claim. And then he drops a bombshell. He says it was Ronnie who stabbed Arnulfo repeatedly during the struggle, not him.
Whoa. So he's basically saying, don't look at me, look at my relative.
Exactly. And he adds another detail. He says when he was arrested, he didn't point the finger at Ronnie because, get this, no one asked him. Now, this detail, it becomes a key point of contention throughout the case.
I can see why it's a pretty convenient excuse.
It is, and the lower courts and ultimately the Supreme Court, they scrutinize that very carefully.
So how did the trial court weigh all this? You've got the children saying one thing, Almosara saying another. It must have been a tough call.
It was, but the trial court judge, he zeroes in on the fact that the victims' children, Gregorio and Marif, they identified Antonio Almosara as the attacker. They put him right there at the heart of the violence.
Okay, so their testimony is powerful.
It is. And the judge finds Almosara's defense, his denial, and his attempt to blame Ronnie, well, it just doesn't hold water. It seems weak, especially given his silence about Ronnie when he was arrested.
Yeah, it does kind of make you wonder.
It does, and here's another key factor. The trial court concludes that the killing involved treachery.
Treachery, that's a legal term, right?
It is. It basically means the killing was done in a way that was deliberately designed to ensure the victim couldn't defend themselves.
Okay, so it adds another layer of seriousness to the crime.
Absolutely. Now, the Court of Appeals, they have to decide whether they agree with the trial court's assessment.
So what was their take on all this?
They basically back the trial court's judgment. They find the children's identification of Almosara to be credible, even though there are some minor inconsistencies in their accounts.
So some small details might not perfectly align, but the core of their story is consistent.
Exactly. And the appellate court, they also agree that the killing was done with treachery.
So it's moving up the legal ladder, and the core findings are holding up.
That's right. But now we get to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And I think this is where it gets especially fascinating for anyone who's interested in how our legal system works. Because here we're dealing with young witnesses, a brutal crime, and the challenge of determining the truth.
Yeah, you really have to wonder, how did the Supreme Court approach this? How did they justify upholding these rulings, especially when the key witnesses were kids?
Well, they rely on a long-standing legal principle. Appellate courts, including the Supreme Court, they tend to give a lot of deference to what the trial courts decide, especially when it comes to facts.
Like they trust the judgment of the trial court judge.
Exactly. And there's a good reason for this. The trial judge, he's the one who actually sees the witnesses, hears them speak, observes their demeanor, their body language. It gives them a unique perspective that higher courts, who only see written transcripts, simply don't have.
Oh, that makes sense. Like being there in person makes a difference.
It really does. But of course, the fact that these witnesses were children, that adds another layer of complexity.
And did the Supreme Court address that?
Absolutely. They tackled it head on. They pointed out that under Philippine law, children are actually presumed to be competent witnesses. Their testimony carries weight in court if they're deemed capable of understanding right from wrong, if they're able to perceive what happened, and if they can clearly communicate what they saw and heard.
Okay, so they're not automatically discounted just because of their age.
Not at all. And here's another crucial point the Supreme Court makes. Minor inconsistencies in a child's testimony, they don't automatically mean the child is lying.
Huh. That's interesting. So, like, some little variations in their story don't necessarily invalidate it?
Not at all. In fact, the court suggests that sometimes those little discrepancies might actually be a good sign.
Really? How so?
Well, it could indicate that their account hasn't been rehearsed or coached by adults. It suggests a natural memory, not a scripted one.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. So a perfectly polished, perfectly consistent story from a child might actually raise some red flags.
Exactly. The Supreme Court also highlights something else. They say there was no apparent reason for these children to make up such a horrible accusation against Antonio Almosara. They didn't have a motive to lie, so their identification of him carries a lot of weight.
So the absence of a clear motive strengthens their credibility.
It does. And the court, they recognize that children, especially those who've witnessed something traumatic, they're not going to remember things with the same level of detail and precision as adults.
Yeah, it must be so difficult for them to process what they've seen and put it into words.
It absolutely is. Now let's go back to Almosara's defense. What did the Supreme Court make of his claim that it was actually Ronnie who was responsible for the murder?
Yeah, that was a pretty big accusation to throw out there.
It was, and the Supreme Court doesn't buy it. They point to the fact that Almosara never mentioned Ronnie as the attacker when he was first arrested. He didn't bring it up during the early stages of the investigation. It only came up much later when he was already in deep legal trouble.
So the timing of that accusation, it kind of works against him.
It really does. It casts doubt on his story, especially when you compare it to the consistent and straightforward accounts from the children.
Right, their testimony seems much more believable in that context.
That's how the Supreme Court saw it. So, to sum up, it seems like the children's unwavering identification of Almosara, combined with his own unconvincing defense, were key factors in the court's decision.
It sounds like those were the most compelling pieces of the puzzle.
They were, but there's more. The Supreme Court also upheld the finding of treachery. They emphasized the suddenness of the attack, how Antonio Almosara went straight for Arnulfo, pinned him down, and started stabbing him repeatedly.
And that meant Arnulfo had no chance to defend himself, right?
That's right. And the fact that he was pinned down, it shows a deliberate method of attack, one designed to ensure the killing without any risk to the attackers.
So premeditation and a clear intent to cause harm.
Exactly. Now, remember how the original charges included taking advantage of superior strength? Multiple attackers against one victim?
Yes, is.
Well, the Supreme Court clarifies something important about that. They say that when you have treachery, and you also have abuse of superior strength, the latter is generally absorbed into the treachery.
Meaning it doesn't get treated as a separate crime that would increase the punishment?
That's right. It's all part and parcel of the treachery itself. So the final verdict. The murder conviction stands, the life sentence remains in place, and the Supreme Court even adjusts the financial compensation to the victim's family, making sure they're getting what they're legally owed.
So a very thorough and carefully considered decision, even though it was based largely on the testimony of children.
It is, and it really brings up some important questions about the role of young witnesses in our justice system. I mean, we've talked about how the courts try to ensure the reliability of their testimony, but it's a complex issue, right? Especially when you consider the potential impact of trauma and the vulnerability of children.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It does, and we want to hear from you. What do you think? How do we balance the need for justice with the need to protect vulnerable witnesses, especially children? It's a discussion worth having.
Absolutely. And for those who found this deep dive insightful, don't forget to tap that favorite button and share your thoughts in the comments.
We always appreciate hearing from you. And before we wrap up, let's do a quick recap of some of those key legal principles that came into play in this case.
Good idea.
So, first up, treachery.
Right. So treachery, as the Supreme Court highlighted, is when someone specifically chooses a method of attack that's designed to make sure the victim can't defend themselves. It's about eliminating risk to the attacker while guaranteeing the success of the crime.
And that element of ensuring the victim can't fight back, that's crucial, right?
It is. It goes to the heart of what makes treachery so serious in the eyes of the law.
Now, what about the whole issue of child witnesses and how their testimony is viewed by the courts?
So, the law, it starts with the presumption that children are capable of being witnesses. Their words matter, but their testimony is only given full weight if they're deemed competent. That means they can understand right from wrong, they can perceive what happened around them, and they can communicate those perceptions effectively.
And those little inconsistencies we talked about, those don't automatically disqualify their testimony, do they?
No, they don't. In fact, sometimes they can even strengthen it because it shows that they're not just reciting a rehearsed story.
Interesting. And then there's the defense of denial.
Denial, when someone just says, I didn't do it, that's generally considered a weak defense, especially when you have credible witnesses pointing the finger. And in this case, Almosara's denial, it just wasn't backed up by any solid evidence.
And finally, that concept of abuse of superior strength being absorbed into treachery.
Yeah, so basically, if you've got a situation where the killing was done with treachery and the attackers also had an advantage in terms of numbers or weapons, that advantage is usually considered part and parcel of the treachery itself. It's not treated as a separate aggravating factor.
So a lot of legal nuances at play in this case really highlights how complex our justice system can be.
It does. And it shows how the courts have to weigh all sorts of factors, from witness testimony to legal principles, to arrive at a just decision.
Absolutely. And if you're fascinated by these kinds of legal deep dives, if you want to explore more cases that really make you think about the meaning of justice, well, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more.
We'll be here, ready to dive into the next compelling case.
That's right. And until then, keep those legal minds sharp, folks.
And stay curious.
Always stay curious.